Here is the famous Berlin Sleeper on its way to raid Frosinone Aerodrome near Rome. The 103 bombing missions of this remarkable fortress include targets in France, Holland, Belgium, Tunisia, Italian Libya, Pantelleria, Sardinia, Sicily, and Italy. The Sleeper is now back in the States. Moving day for the 321st Bombardment Group brought thunderstorms, heavy showers, and mud. Planes, tractors, and men were bogged down to a snail's pace by the weather conditions. But in the 48 hours allotted for the job, the camp was torn down, equipment and supplies loaded and packed, and the movement completed.
376 American bombers took off from England one Tuesday morning in August of 1943. 60 of them did not come home. 600 American men, killed, missing, or captured. In a single afternoon, they had died because no fighter in the Allied inventory could fly with them all the way to their target in Germany and back. The aeroplane that would eventually solve that problem, the aeroplane that would bring your father, or your uncle, or the man down the street who never talked about the war, home from the skies over Berlin, had already been sitting in a hangar in Cambridgeshire for over a year. The Royal Air Force had test flown it. The Royal Air Force had rejected it. The Royal Air Force was using it to shoot at trains. And on a gray morning in April of 1942, 16 months before those bombers burned over Schweinfurt, one man was about to climb into its cockpit for 30 minutes and see what nobody else had seen. This is the story of those 30 minutes and of the men who paid for them with their lives so that other men could come home. The morning was gray at Royal Air Force Duxford in Cambridgeshire on the 30th of April, 1942. A damp wind was pulling across the concrete apron, the kind of wind that gets into a man's coat and stays there. And standing at the edge of that apron, hands pushed into his pockets, was a 32-year-old test pilot named Ronald Harker. Everyone called him Ronnie. He was looking up at an aircraft he had never flown before, and nothing about it looked right. The nose was too long, the wing was too thin, the radiator scoop was slung underneath the belly like an afterthought, like someone had bolted it on at the last minute and forgotten to hide the seams. Every fighter Ronnie Harker had flown for the last decade had been British. The Hawker Hurricane, the Supermarine Spitfire, the Bristol Blenheim. Aircraft designed by men he knew, in factories he had visited, tested by pilots whose names he could recite from memory. This one was American. It had come across the Atlantic by ship, in pieces, in a wooden crate stamped with the address of an aircraft factory in Inglewood, California, a place Harker had never been to, a place he could not quite picture in his head. The men who had built this machine had never met a Royal Air Force pilot. They had never seen the weather it would have to fight in. They had never been shot at by a Messerschmitt 109 on a cold morning over the Channel. And yet here it sat, fueled, warm, propeller turning lazily in the breeze, waiting for a man whose entire professional reputation was built on knowing what an aeroplane should feel like when it was good. Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord, the commanding officer of the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, was standing a few paces behind him. Campbell Ord had a problem, and he had invited Harker down from Hucknall to help him solve it. His unit had been testing this new American fighter for several weeks. The official verdict, written and stamped and filed in triplicate, was that the aircraft was a disappointment. Above 18,000 feet, it fell off badly. At 20,000 feet, it was slower than a Spitfire Mark V, and Spitfire Mark Vs were being shot down in increasing numbers by a German fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, that the Royal Air Force had not yet found an answer to. By every measurement that mattered, the American aeroplane could not do what Fighter Command needed a fighter to do. It could not climb high enough to fight the Luftwaffe over France. The Air Ministry had already made its decision. This machine would be sent down to low-level work, reconnaissance, ground attack, strafing trucks and trains along the French coast, work that the Curtiss Tomahawk could do almost as well, and had been doing for over a year. On paper, the aircraft was a failure. But Campbell Ord did not believe the paper. He had watched this machine fly, and what he had watched did not match what the report said. He could not explain it. He was a fighter pilot by background, not an engineer, and he had a feel for an aeroplane that papermen do not always have. Something about the Mustang, he told Harker quietly, does not add up. So he had picked up the telephone, and he had asked Rolls-Royce to send him their best test pilot. Harker walked out to the machine. The harness was unfamiliar. The instrument layout was in the wrong places for his hands. The throttle, in the American style, moved the opposite way from a British throttle, and he had to stop himself from jerking it back when he meant to push it forward. He started the engine. A 12-cylinder Allison V1710, a workmanlike American power plant, designed for low-altitude performance, with a single-speed supercharger that had been the source of every complaint anyone had ever filed about this aircraft. He taxied out, lined up, pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang leapt. What happened over the next 30 minutes is the question this entire story turns on, because when Ronnie Harker came back down at Duxford that afternoon, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked across the apron to find Campbell Ord, he did not say what every other senior Royal Air Force test pilot had been saying about the Mustang for the last 6 weeks. He said something else, something that, the very next morning, he would put on paper in a short report that would alter the course of the air war in Europe, and, by every honest reckoning that historians have made since, would shorten the war itself by a measurable margin. He had just flown an American airplane that his own service had already decided was a disappointment, and he had stepped out of it convinced that he had just sat in the finest fighter airframe in the world. The only thing wrong with it, he was about to argue, was the engine, and he knew exactly which engine should be in there instead. To understand why a Rolls-Royce test pilot in a Cambridgeshire field could change a war by writing a short memo about an American fighter, we have to go back. Not to 1942, not even to the beginning of the war. We have to go back to a small office in New York City in the spring of 1940, where a desperate British civil servant sat across a desk from an American aircraft executive and asked him to build copies of an aeroplane that both men knew was already obsolete. France was about to fall. The Royal Air Force was burning through Hurricanes and Spitfires faster than the British factories could replace them, and a man named Sir Henry Self, who ran the aircraft procurement side of the British Purchasing Commission in New York, had been given a job almost beyond reckoning. He was to find American aircraft, any American aircraft, that could fight in European skies, and he was to find them in months, not years. The American fighter situation, by European standards, was bleak. There was the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, an adequate low-altitude fighter that could not match a Messerschmitt 109 above 15,000 feet. There was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, a strange mid-engine design that performed even worse at altitude. There was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engined fighter that was promising but not yet in production. And there was nothing else. Self had gone to the Curtiss-Wright Corporation and asked whether they could build more P-40s. Curtiss-Wright had told him their factories were already at capacity. The British were stuck. Then, in late April of 1940, the president of a smaller aircraft company called North American Aviation walked into Self's office. His name was James Howard Kindleberger. Everyone called him Dutch. Dutch Kindleberger was a hard-nosed executive who did not waste words. Self asked him to build P-40s under license. Kindleberger said no. North American, he said, could design a better fighter from scratch in less time than it would take to set up a licensed production line for someone else's aeroplane. He gave self a number, 120 days from contract signing to a flying prototype. Self thought about it, and he agreed. There were conditions. The British insisted that North American purchase the wind tunnel data from a Curtiss project called the XP-46. They did not want two American companies wasting resources on the same aerodynamic questions. North American paid Curtiss $56,000 for the data. The chief engineers on the new project were named Edward Horkey and Edgar Schmude. Schmude was the man who mattered. He was German-born, an immigrant to the United States, who had spent his career in the smaller American aircraft companies of the 1920s and 30s. He had worked for Fokker. He had worked for General Aviation. He had never worked for Messerschmitt. Though later, in a small, factual error that would not matter, someone else would write down that he had. Schmued ran the preliminary design office at North American under the chief engineer Raymond Rice. He was a quiet, methodical man who drew with a draftsman's discipline. The team he led was small. They worked late into every night. By the recollection of one of them, they went home only on Sundays, at 6 in the evening. When the Curtiss wind tunnel data arrived, Schmude and Horkey looked at it, and they set it aside. Almost none of it was useful. The Curtiss XP-46 was a conventional design. What North American had in mind was not. The airframe was rolled out 102 days after contract signing. On the 9th of September, 1940, it had no engine. The Allison WW2 1710, when it arrived 18 days later, came with electrical fittings that did not match the existing motor mounts. North Americans simply built a new motor mount and bolted the engine in. On the 26th of October, 1940, a freelance test pilot named Vance Breeze took the prototype into the air at Mines Field in Los Angeles, the airport that is now Los Angeles International. The first flight lasted 5 minutes. Later, the same day, Breeze took her up again, this time for 10 minutes. Over the following weeks, he flew her again and again, and by his own quiet remarks to the ground crew, he was deeply impressed. On the 9th of December, 1940, a contract amendment gave the new airplane a name. The British named it. They called it the Mustang. The first production Mustang, Mark I, serial number Alpha Golf 345, was test flown by a North American pilot named Lewis Waite on the 23rd of April, 1941. The first deliveries to Britain began later that year. And in January of 1942, the first Mustangs reached number 26 Squadron at Royal Air Force Gatwick, replacing the Curtiss Tomahawks the squadron had been flying. And here, almost immediately, came the disappointment. The Allison engine in the Mustang, Mark I, had a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. It had been chosen for one specific reason. The United States War Department had reserved its turbo supercharger production for 4-engined bombers and was unwilling to release the technology for fighter export. The engine that resulted was a perfectly good power plant up to 15,000 feet. Above that, it ran out of breath. At 20,000 feet, the Mustang's maximum speed dropped to 357 miles per hour, slower than a Spitfire Mark V, slower than a Messerschmitt 109F. Its rate of climb to 20,000 feet was 11 minutes. A Spitfire Mark V did the same climb in 7. By every measurement that mattered for the air war over occupied Europe, the Mustang was a second-tier aircraft. Royal Air Force Fighter Command did not want it. The Mustangs were sent instead to Army Cooperation Command, a backwater outfit responsible for low-level reconnaissance, photo runs, and tactical work. They flew their first operational sortie on the 10th of May, 1942. Flying Officer G. N. Dawson of No. 26 Squadron took off from Gatwick, crossed the Channel, and shot up a goods train near the town of Burke on the French coast. It was, by any honest reckoning, exactly the kind of mission a Tomahawk could have flown. The Royal Air Force had ordered an airplane to win a war, And what it had got, according to every report it filed, was an aeroplane to strafe trucks. What no one in the official chain of command yet understood was that the airframe under that Allison engine was not just incrementally better than what came before it. It was a generational leap. The Mustang was the first fighter in history to use a laminar flow wing. An airfoil section developed jointly by North American and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the American government body that would one day become NASA. The laminar flow wing produced dramatically less drag at high speed than any conventional wing then flying. The fuselage had been mathematically lofted from conic sections, one of the first aircraft in the world to be designed that way. The resulting shape was so smooth that air slid over it almost without resistance. The radiator was tucked under the belly in a duct that, by a piece of unintentional genius, exploited what aerodynamicists call the Meredith effect. The heated air leaving the radiator actually produced a small amount of forward thrust. And the fuel tanks. The Mustang carried roughly 180 U.S. gallons of fuel internally in 2 wing tanks. The Spitfire carried less than 100 imperial gallons. By every aerodynamic measure that did not depend on the engine, the Mustang was years ahead of every other piston fighter in the world, and the Royal Air Force was using it for tactical work. In April of 1942, the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford received a Mustang Mark I, serial Alpha Golf 422, for high-altitude evaluation. Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord watched the test reports come in, and he saw exactly what every other Royal Air Force officer had seen. Above 18,000 feet, the aircraft was disappointing. Below 15,000 feet, it was extraordinary. At 5,000 feet, it was 30 miles per hour, faster than a Spitfire Mark V-C. At 15,000 feet, it was 35 miles per hour faster, despite the Spitfire having a more powerful engine. There was something fundamental about this airframe that no one at the Air Ministry seemed to be paying attention to. Campbell Ord had been a fighter pilot in his earlier career, and he had a feel for an airplane that paper engineers did not always have. He looked at the Mustang sitting on his apron at Duxford, and what he saw was not a failed fighter. He saw a magnificent aircraft with the wrong engine. He picked up the telephone and called Hucknall. He asked for Ronnie Harker. And on the morning of the 30th of April, 1942, on a damp Cambridgeshire apron, Ronnie Harker climbed into a cockpit that did not fit his hands, started an American engine, taxied out, and pushed the throttle forward. He would not know it as he lifted off. But in the next 30 minutes, he was about to see something that everyone else on 2 continents had missed. The engine caught, the propeller bit air, and the Mustang rolled forward. Ronnie Harker felt the tail come up almost at once. The acceleration was not what he expected. It was cleaner, smoother, like a horse that had been waiting all morning to be let out of the paddock. He rotated. The wheels came up. The English countryside dropped away underneath him. For the next 30 minutes, he flew. Not hard, not aerobatically. He flew the way a professional test pilot flies an unfamiliar machine, slowly, methodically, feeling for the edges of the envelope, rolling gently left, rolling gently right, watching how the aeroplane settled after each input, watching how it wanted to be flown. And what he was finding, up there in the gray Cambridgeshire sky, did not match a single line of what the official reports had told him he was going to find. Below 15,000 feet, the Mustang was faster than any single-engined fighter he had ever flown. Faster than the Spitfire, faster than the Hurricane, faster than the Whirlwind. The controls were beautifully harmonized. The stick forces were light without being twitchy. The aeroplane sat in the sky as if it belonged there. There was only one thing wrong with it. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine began to run out of breath. Exactly as the reports had said, the supercharger could not keep up. The power fell away. The Mustang, which had been the most exciting fighter Harker had ever touched, became sluggish, ordinary, unremarkable. He climbed a little higher, watched the airspeed indicator sag, watched the boost gauge drop, and in that moment, quietly, without ceremony, he understood something. The airframe was not the problem. The engine was. He brought her down at Duxford, taxied to dispersal, cut the ignition, sat for a long moment in the cockpit with the harness still buckled, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Then he climbed out. He walked across the wet concrete to find Campbell Ordy, and the two men stood there together for a long time, not saying very much. There is no film of that conversation, no transcript, no witness who wrote it down word for word. What we know is only what Harker did next. And what he did next is this. He got into his car, he drove north, back to Hucknall, 7 miles from Nottingham, where the Rolls-Royce flight test establishment was based. He walked into the building, Kio. But before he sat down at his desk to write the report, he did something else first, something that most accounts of this story leave out, something that was, in the end, more important than the report itself. He picked up the telephone. He called a man named Ray Dory. Dory was the head of the Rolls-Royce Experimental Flight Test Division at Hucknall, and Harker asked him a single question. How quickly could a Merlin 61 be fitted into a Mustang airframe? Dory did not laugh. He did not tell Harker to slow down and write it up properly. He listened, and then he said he would look into it. That telephone call was the moment the war changed. The next morning, the 1st of May, 1942, Harker sat down and wrote his report. It was short. It was written in the language of a working test pilot. There was no exclamation. There was no summons to history. He listed the aircraft's strengths. He listed its weaknesses. He proposed, in plain technical terms, what should be done about the weaknesses. The Mustang, he wrote, appeared to him to be a formidable low and medium altitude fighter, and with a more powerful engine, specifically the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, then being prepared for the new Spitfire Mark IX, its performance could be outstanding. He made one small factual error in that report. He wrote that the Mustang had been designed by a former Messerschmitt engineer. It was not true. Edgar Schmood had never worked for Messerschmitt. He had worked for Fokker, and he had worked for General Aviation, and he had never set foot in a German fighter design office in his life. But by 1942, the story had circulated somewhere in the American aviation press, and Harker, in the pressure of writing quickly, wrote it down. The mistake did not matter. What mattered was the recommendation. What mattered was the phone call the day before. Because inside 48 hours, Ray Dory had walked Harker's suggestion into the office of Ernest Hives, the head of Rolls-Royce. Hives had taken it to Sir Wilfrid Freeman, the vice chief of the air staff, and by the 13th of May, 1942, 12 days after Harker's flight, an Air Ministry meeting had authorized the conversion. 5 Mustang airframes were to be sent to Hucknall. Rolls-Royce was to fit them with Merlin engines. The whole project, for security reasons, was given the deliberately dull designation Mustang X. If your father served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, or your grandfather, or your uncle, if he flew, or if he worked on the ground crews that kept the airplanes running through the Cambridgeshire winters, if he was a rigger, or an armorer, or a radio mechanic, leave his unit and his station in the comments below. The records preserve some of these men. Many more are remembered only by their families. Every comment that names one of them keeps a piece of that history alive a little longer. Now, what the authorization did not tell you was how close the whole thing had come to being killed, because Rolls-Royce, in the spring of 1942, had every reason to say no. The Merlin engine was the most strategically important piece of British industrial output of the entire war. Every Merlin that came off the production lines was already promised. to a Spitfire, to a Lancaster bomber, to a Mosquito, to a Beaufighter, to a Halifax. There was quite literally no spare engine capacity. The Air Ministry's first instinct was to refuse. The Merlin 61s were earmarked for the new Spitfire Mark IX, which was urgently needed to deal with the Focke-Wulf 190. Diverting Merlins to an American airframe seemed at first like robbing the home defense to subsidize a foreign experiment. What overcame the resistance was not paperwork. It was one man, Sir Wilfrid Freeman. Freeman had already done this once before. He had championed the de Havilland Mosquito against fierce Air Ministry resistance. And the Mosquito had, in the end, proved him right. He had built up the kind of political credit that senior officials only earn by being correct when other senior officials were wrong. He spent that credit on the Mustang. Without Sir Wilfrid Freeman, this story ends here. His name is not on the aeroplane. It is not on the museum plaques. It is not in the air show programs that fly overhead every summer in England and America. But if you strip everything else out of the story and ask which single man kept the Merlin Mustang alive when the ministries wanted to kill it, the answer is Freeman. And while the British were fighting inside their own ministry, something else was happening across the Atlantic. An American officer stationed at the United States Embassy in London had heard about the proposal. His name was Thomas Hitchcock, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army Air Forces, Assistant Air Attaché. If you had passed him on a street in London in 1942, you would not have picked him out as one of the most consequential Americans in the entire war. He was a quiet man, middle-aged, 42 years old, graying at the temples. But he had, before the war, been widely regarded as the greatest polo player of the interwar years. He had held a 10-goal handicap, which is the highest handicap the sport recognizes, for 18 of the 19 seasons he played the game. He had social access at the very highest levels of the American establishment. He knew men who took his telephone calls. He knew men who read his letters. And when Hitchcock heard what Rolls-Royce was proposing to do to the Mustang, he saw immediately what it meant, not just for the British, for the Americans. He sent word back to Washington. His reports reached General Henry Arnold, the commander of the United States Army Air Forces, and Arnold, in his cautious way, became interested. Interested is a small word for what followed, because in August of 1942, before a single Merlin Mustang had flown anywhere, the United States Army Air Forces placed an order for 400 production P-51 Bravos, 400 aircraft, ordered on the strength of a paper calculation. The calculation had been done by a man whose name is almost never spoken in the American accounts of this story. His name was Witold Chalier. He was Polish. He had come to Britain ahead of the German advance and had ended up as chief aerodynamic engineer at Rolls-Royce's Hucknall establishment. He sat at a drawing board 7 miles north of Nottingham and worked out, on paper, what would happen if you put a Merlin 61 into a Mustang airframe. His answer was 441 miles per hour at 25,600 feet. It was a stunning number. It was 40 miles per hour faster than the current Spitfire Mark IX, with vastly greater range. Nobody had ever flown such a combination. It existed only in Chalier's calculations. The Americans ordered 400 of them anyway. The engineers at Allison, the American engine company whose power plant had made the original Mustang a disappointment, must have felt ill. The conversion work began at Hucknall in June of 1942. 5. Mustang Mark I's were pulled aside. Serial numbers Alpha Lima 975, Alpha Mike 203, Alpha Mike 208, Alpha Lima 963, Alpha Mike 121. Each one had its Allison engine unbolted and lifted out by crane. Each one had its motor mount rebuilt. Each one had a Merlin 65, an engine almost identical to the one going into the Spitfire Mark IX, lowered into the space where the Allison had been. A new radiator was fitted under the nose, a chin scoop, The two-stage supercharger of the Merlin ran hotter than the single-stage Allison, and the original belly radiator could not handle the extra heat alone. A four-bladed Rotol propeller was fitted in place of the original three-bladed Curtiss Electric. The extra power of the Merlin needed more blade area to convert into thrust. Each of these decisions was made by engineers working under deadline pressure, often without formal authorization, on the assumption that if the airplane proved itself in the air, the paperwork could be reconciled afterward. This is the way major industrial breakthroughs almost always happen in wartime. They do not come down from the top in fully formed plans. They emerge from the middle, from the engineers and the test pilots and the production foremen, from men working in cold drawing offices at 3 a.m, recalculating supercharger gear ratios by the light of a single desk lamp. The first conversion, Alpha Lima 975, was ready in October of 1942. On the 13th, Captain Ronald Shepard climbed into the cockpit. Shepard was the chief test pilot for Rolls-Royce, a quiet, deeply experienced man who had flown almost every prototype the company had produced in the previous decade. He knew what he was looking at when he saw it. The engine started, the propellers spun up, and Alpha Lima 975, the first Merlin Mustang in history, taxied out onto the grass at Hucknall. Shepard took her up. By November, the small test fleet was delivering everything Ronnie Harker had predicted, and more. Alpha Mike 208 reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. Alpha Lima 975 reached an absolute ceiling of 40,600 feet, an altitude no Allison Mustang had ever come close to. The high-altitude performance, the thing the Allison Mustang had been mocked for, was now better than the Spitfires. The pilots who flew the Mustang X came down speaking the way Ronnie Harker had spoken in April, with a kind of stunned restraint, as if the words for what they had just experienced were not quite available to them yet. The Royal Air Force test reports from Hucknall and from the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down used dry, careful professional language. The numbers were unmistakable. The Mustang, with a Merlin in it, was faster than anything the Germans had, faster than anything the Americans had, faster by a measurable margin than the Spitfire whose engine it was now sharing, the fastest piston-engined fighter in the world. And now the story crosses the Atlantic, because the Americans, alerted to what Rolls-Royce was doing, had not been waiting. On the 25th of July, 1942, North American Aviation had been authorized to convert 2 of its own airframes to take Packard-built Merlins. The Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit had been licensed to build Merlin engines under British license since September of 1940. The American-built version was designated the V1650. It was already rolling off the production lines when the conversion authorization came through. The company designation for the new aircraft was NA-101. The Army designation was originally XP-78. By mid-October, it had been quietly renamed XP-51 Bravo. On the 30th of November, 1942, just 6 weeks after Ronald Shepard's first flight at Hucknall, a North American test pilot named Robert Chilton climbed into the first XP-51 Bravo at Mines Field in Los Angeles. Chilton was not the sort of man who wasted an opportunity. He did not run the usual sequence of low-speed handling checks. He did not spend 40 minutes cataloging the trim characteristics. He took off, and he climbed straight up. At 20,000 feet, the two-stage supercharger shifted automatically into high gear, and the Merlin kept pulling. Chilton went past 25,000, past 28,000, past 30,000 feet, higher than any Mustang had ever been. The airplane was still climbing strongly. The controls were still crisp. The engine was still making full power. His flight report from that day is not the elaborate prose of a man composing for posterity. It is the abbreviated technical notes of a working test pilot with a stopwatch and a notebook, but the numbers he wrote down were extraordinary. The XP-51 Bravo reached a level top speed of 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet, more than 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison Mustang at the same altitude. Its rate of climb, at every altitude tested, had roughly doubled. The paper calculation Witold Chalier had done in a drawing office at Hucknall 6 months earlier had been proved correct almost to the mile per hour. The Americans expanded the order. 400 aircraft became 2,200. By 1944, the Mustang would be built at 2 plants, Inglewood in California and a new facility in Dallas, Texas, on a scale that no British factory could have matched. But before the mass production began, before the Merlin Mustang reached its combat units, something else happened. Something that has been almost entirely buried under the more famous escort missions of 1944. On the 19th of August, 1942, the disastrous combined operations raid on the French port of Dieppe took place. Operation Jubilee. 6,000 Canadian and British troops thrown onto a heavily defended beach for reasons that historians are still arguing about. The landing force suffered catastrophic casualties. But high above the beaches that morning, 4 squadrons of Allison-engined Mustangs from Royal Air Force Gatwick and adjoining airfields flew tactical reconnaissance for the operation. 72 sorties were flown that day. 9 aircraft were shot down, 5 of them from No. 26 Squadron alone. The men who had been flying reconnaissance a few months earlier were now dying over French sand and burning tanks. And in the smoke over Dieppe, an American volunteer flying with No. 414 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force put his sights on a Focke-Wulf 190 and squeezed the trigger. His name was Hollis Hills, pilot officer. He was an American who had crossed into Canada before his own country entered the war, and had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force to fight sooner. The Focke-Wulf went down. It was the first enemy aircraft ever destroyed by a P-51 Mustang in air-to-air combat. Hills did not know it. He did not know that he had just opened a chapter that would, 3 years later, end with Mustangs strafing aircraft on the runways outside Berlin. He was simply a young pilot in an aeroplane his own senior commanders had called second-rate, doing what the situation in front of him required. He landed. He filed his combat report. He walked back to his hut. And 2 months later, on the 21st of October, 1942, 4 more Allison Mustangs, this time from No. 268 Squadron, took off from an English airfield and flew low across the North Sea. They crossed the Dutch coast. They kept going, and they attacked targets near the Dortmund-Ems Canal, inside Germany. The German Air Defense Command, when the reports came in, refused at first to believe them. Single-engined fighters based in Britain, according to every intelligence assessment they had produced for the previous 3 years, could not reach German territory. It was, they had told their superiors, aerodynamically impossible. 4 Mustangs had just done it. None of those 4 Mustangs had a Merlin in it. They were Allison Mark Is, the original disappointment, the aeroplane the Royal Air Force had sent down for tactical work. And it was already, in the autumn of 1942, doing things the Germans had told their own high command could not be done. The Merlin would, 18 months later, multiply the capability by an order of magnitude. But the seed of the long-range fighter mission, the ability to take the war to the German heartland in daylight, at a cost the Allies could sustain, was already present in the airframe before the engine was changed, and now the production lines were opening. Inglewood, Dallas, Packard and Detroit, thousands of Merlin Mustangs were about to start rolling off the assembly lines. Thousands of young men on both sides of the Atlantic were about to start training to fly them. But between the first XP-51 Bravo lifting off from Mansfield in November of 1942 and the day the Mustang would fly its first combat mission over Europe, there was a gap, a long gap, almost a year, and in that year, over the skies of Germany. The American daylight bombing campaign was about to walk into the worst disaster in the history of strategic air warfare, because the production of the P-51 Bravo would not begin at Inglewood until June of 1943, and the fuselage fuel tank, the 85-gallon tank behind the pilot's seat that would give the Mustang the range to reach Berlin, would not be ordered installed until July, installed hastily, under pressure, in a way that would, in the end, kill one of the men who had fought hardest to make the airplane exist, but that death was still 18 months away. For now, in the winter of 1942, the young American bomber crews were preparing to cross the ocean for the first time and to fly, unescorted, into the heart of Germany. They did not yet know what was waiting for them. The 17th of August, 1943, a Tuesday, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from airfields scattered across eastern England. They climbed out of the morning mist and formed up in the sky over the North Sea in long, staggered boxes, each box designed to bring the maximum number of defensive machine guns to bear against any German fighter that came at them. Their targets that day were the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, deep inside Germany, well beyond the range of any escorting fighter the 8th Air Force possessed. The doctrine that sent them was simple. The bombers, the manuals said, would defend themselves, massed formations, 50-caliber machine guns pointing in every direction, a flying fortress, exactly as its name suggested. The doctrine had never been tested against a fully alerted German fighter force. That day it was. 60 bombers did not come home, 60 aircraft, 600 American men, 16% of the force, in a single afternoon. The men who came back landed in silence. Ground crews walked out to the hard stands and found bombers with their radios torn out by cannon shells, with blood pooled on the flight deck, with men still strapped in their seats who could not be moved because they had been dead for 2 hours before the aeroplane landed. The 8th Air Force absorbed the loss, rebuilt, trained new crews, and tried again. On the 14th of October, 1943, 2 months to the day after the first Schweinfurt raid, they went back. 291 bombers this time. 60 were shot down in the air. 17 more were written off after they crawled back to England, damaged beyond repair. Effective losses that day approached 1 aircraft in 4. The men who flew that mission called it Black Thursday. If you flew a B-17 out of England in 1943, the statistical odds that you would complete your tour of 25 combat missions were, by the best calculation the 8th Air Force could produce, 1 in 4. 3 out of every 4 men who climbed into a flying fortress in 1943 would not climb out of one at the end of their tour. No air force in the history of aerial warfare had ever been able to absorb such losses for long. The doctrine that had sent them, the doctrine that said the bomber could defend itself, was finished. It had been finished for months. What the 2 Schweinfurt raids proved, in blood, was that everyone had known it was finished, and no one had yet been willing to say so out loud. The bombers needed escorts. Every senior officer in the 8th Air Force had known it since the summer of 1942. But no fighter in the Allied inventory had the range to escort them all the way to a target deep inside Germany and back. The Republic, 47. Thunderbolt could go part of the way. The Lockheed P-38. Lightning could go a little further. The British Spitfire, magnificent over the English Channel, could barely reach the German border. The bombers had been dying because there was nothing to send with them. And then, in the winter of 1943, that changed. The 354th Fighter Group arrived at Royal Air Force Boxted in Essex in November of 1943. Their aircraft were fresh from the Inglewood production line, Merlin-powered P-51 Bravos. On the 1st of December, 1943, the group flew its first combat mission under the operational control of the 8th Fighter Command. It was a sweep, no combat, just a demonstration that the aircraft existed, that it worked, that it could be counted on to reach the continent and come home again. But something had arrived in England that no German pilot yet fully understood. The Merlin Mustang had drop tanks, big ones, 108 gallons apiece under each wing, plus the 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat that the United States Army Air Forces had ordered, fitted in July. Over the objections of North American aviation's own engineers who worried about the effect on stability. With those tanks, the Mustang's combat radius pushed past 800 miles. 800 miles from an airfield in eastern England put a fighter over Berlin. For the first time in the war, an Allied single-engined fighter could go anywhere the bombers went and stay long enough to fight when they got there. And in January of 1944, a new man took command of the 8th Air Force. His name was James Doolittle, Lieutenant General. The same Jimmy Doolittle who had led the Tokyo raid in April of 1942 in a stripped-down B-25 off the deck of the USS Hornet. He was a small man, wiry, in his late 40s, with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A test pilot before the war, a man who understood aircraft the way a good horseman understands horses. Shortly after taking command, Doolittle walked into the office of his fighter chief, Major General William Kepner, at the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command. There was a sign on the wall of Kepner's office. Every man who worked there had seen it 1,000 times. The sign said that the duty of the fighter force was to bring the bombers home. Doolittle looked at the sign. He looked at Kepner, and he said, "Take it down." The new sign, he said, was going to read that the duty of the fighter force was to destroy the German Air Force. That was it. That was the change. One sentence, spoken by one man, in one small office in England. In January of 1944, the Mustangs were no longer to fly fixed escort, tied to the bomber boxes and forbidden to leave them. They were to roam, ahead, to the flanks, behind. They were to pursue the German fighters wherever they went, down through the clouds, down onto the airfields, to hunt. The German pilots did not yet know it, but the rules of the game had just changed underneath them. From January to April of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost something on the order of 1,000 single-engined fighter pilots. Killed, missing, wounded, Adolf Galland, the German general of the fighter arm, told his American interrogators after the war, in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted in the summer of 1945, that the appearance of long-range escort fighters had been the decisive turning point of the air war over Germany. The Germans were not short of aircraft. Their factories were still building fighters, more of them than they had built at any point in the war. What they were short of was pilots, experienced pilots, men who had been through the training and had survived long enough to become good at what they did. The Mustangs killed those men faster than the German training pipeline could replace them. By D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, the sky over Normandy belonged almost completely to the Allies. The German Air Force had, by every honest measure, been broken. The Mustang did not do it alone. The Spitfire had done its share. The Thunderbolt had done its share. The Lightning, the Typhoon, every Allied fighter in the theater had a hand in it. But the Mustang was the airplane that made the daylight bombing campaign survivable. And the daylight bombing campaign, more than any other single instrument in the Allied arsenal, was what bled the German pilot corps dry. There is a quotation that comes up in almost every history of this campaign. It is attributed to Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe. The quotation says that when Göring saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. You have probably heard it. It has been repeated 1,000 times, in books, in television programs, on the plaques of museum aircraft. It may be true. Göring was interrogated at length by American officers in the summer of 1945. The transcripts survive. They are held in American government archives. If you go through them carefully, looking for that famous line, word for word, you will not find it. What you will find is something quieter, a general admission that the arrival of the long-range escorts had changed the war, a recognition that the daylight bombing campaign, once the bombers could be defended all the way to their targets and back, could not be stopped. The famous quotation is a paraphrase. It caught on because it is true in spirit, even if the exact words never left Goering's mouth on the record. The numbers Galen gave his interrogators were not paraphrased. The numbers were exact. 1,000 fighter pilots lost in 4 months, a training pipeline that could not produce replacements fast enough, a war that, from the beginning of 1944 onward, the Luftwaffe was going to lose no matter what its factories built. That was the Mustang's work. That was what the airframe Ronnie Harker had flown for 30 minutes over Cambridgeshire, and the engine Sir Wilfrid Freeman had fought to install in it, and the drop tanks the American production line had bolted underneath the wings had made possible. But one of the men who had fought hardest to make the airplane exist did not live to see it happen. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the polo player, the assistant air attaché at the American Embassy in London, the man whose reports had reached General Arnold in Washington and started the American conversion program on its way. By 1944, Hitchcock had been transferred from the embassy. He was serving now as Deputy Chief of Staff for the 9th Air Support Command. He was 44 years old. His hair had gone gray. He had a wife and children at home in America, whom he had not seen in over a year. One of his ongoing concerns in that job was the longitudinal stability problem the P-51 Bravo had developed once the 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat was filled with fuel. The tank had been ordered installed in July of 1943 under pressure to extend range. It had been fitted quickly, and it had introduced a shift in the aircraft's center of gravity that the pilots had learned to fly around, but that had never been properly solved. Hitchcock was not the kind of officer who left problems like that to other people. On the 18th of April, 1944, he took a P-51 Bravo up personally from an airfield near Salisbury, in Wiltshire, to run flight tests on the stability problem himself. At altitude, during a diving maneuver, the aircraft came apart. There was no fire. There was no distress call. Witnesses on the ground saw the Mustang enter a dive and then simply break up in the air. Pieces of the wings and the tail spun away in different directions. The main fuselage came down separately, still recognizable, and hit the ground somewhere near the village of Salisbury. Hitchcock was killed instantly. He was 44 years old, 2 weeks before he died. The Merlin Mustangs of the 8th Air Force had been ranging deep over Germany, doing exactly what he had spent 2 years in London arguing they could do. The airplane he had saved had killed him, before it had a chance to prove him right at the scale he had always believed it would. He is buried today at the Cambridge American Cemetery, in Mattingley, alongside thousands of other American airmen who did not come home. A quiet, modest grave in a field of white crosses. And Ronnie Harker, the man who started all of it, the 32-year-old Rolls-Royce test pilot who had climbed into a borrowed American fighter on a damp Cambridgeshire morning and flown it for 30 minutes and seen, in that half hour, what nobody else on 2 continents had seen. Harker survived the war. He never flew the Mustang in combat. That was not his role. He was a test pilot. His job was to fly the prototypes and write the reports and pass them up the chain. Other men, younger men, flew what he had helped to create. He received the Order of the British Empire late in his career, a modest decoration, not a knighthood. He was not the kind of man who was ever going to be knighted for what he had done, because what he had done did not translate easily onto a citation. He had written a short memo. He had made a telephone call. He had connected the pieces at the right moment. Bureaucracies do not know how to give medals for things like that. He retired eventually to New Zealand, to a quiet piece of country on the far side of the world from Hucknall, and from Duxford, and from the war. He fished, he flew, whenever he could still get his hands on an airplane. In 1997, at the age of 88, he was invited to take a last flight in a restored P-51 Mustang in the New Zealand summer. He climbed into the cockpit. He put on the harness. He started the Merlin. There is no film of that flight either. What we know is only that he came back down and climbed out. And by the recollection of the men who were there that day, he was smiling. He died on the 30th of May, 1999. He was 90 years old. The obituaries called him the man who put the Merlin in the Mustang, which is not exactly true. He did not put anything into anything. He wrote a memo. He made a phone call. He argued a case with the right man at the right moment. What he actually was, if you strip the mythology off it, was the conductive element in a story that involved dozens of people on both sides of the Atlantic, almost none of whom ever shared a room together. Edgar Schmood designed the airframe. Sir Wilfrid Freeman fought the paperwork through the Air Ministry. Thomas Hitchcock carried the news to Washington and paid for it with his life. And Ronnie Harker, in the middle of all of them, wrote the memo that started the chain reaction. None of them, taken separately, was sufficient. All of them, taken together, were the story. The aeroplane that resulted was not, in any pure sense, an American aeroplane. It was not a British airplane. The airframe was designed in California. The engine was designed in Derby. The engine was built in Detroit under license. The propellers on the American production aircraft were Hamilton Standard. The propellers on the British prototypes were Rotor. The drop tanks that gave the aircraft its escort range were a joint Anglo-American development. There was no single national contribution that made the Mustang what it became. There was a long chain of decisions, taken by men in two countries who in most cases never met one another, whose contributions were each individually small, and whose combination was the finest piston-engined fighter aircraft of the Second World War. The British Purchasing Commission in 1940 did not ask North American aviation to build a war winner. They asked for a stopgap. They wanted aircraft for the gap between what they had and what British production could eventually replace. The Mustang was not designed to be the finest fighter of the war. It was designed to be available. The fact that it became something more than its specification, that it became the instrument that broke the Luftwaffe's day fighter arm and carried the daylight bombing campaign all the way to Berlin and back, is the kind of historical accident that no committee can plan for and no doctrine can predict. It happened because Edgar Schmood and his small team in Inglewood designed an airframe that was, by accident or by intuition, the right airframe. It happened because Rolls-Royce engineers in Derby and Hucknall, working on engines for a completely different aircraft, produced a power plant that was, by accident or by parallel evolution, the right engine. And it happened because on a damp Cambridgeshire morning in April of 1942, a 32-year-old test pilot climbed into a borrowed American cockpit and chose, in the 30 minutes available to him, to see what was actually there, rather than what all the official reports said was there. If this account gave you something to think about tonight, a quiet acknowledgement, a like on the video, a comment naming the man in your family who served, helps the algorithm carry these stories to the next viewer. Because these are the stories that get drowned out. The men who designed the engines, the test pilots who flew the borrowed prototypes, the Polish aerodynamicist who did the calculations in a cold drawing office in Nottingham, the polo player who lies today under a white cross at Mattingly. They do not have their names on the museum aeroplanes. The aeroplanes carry the names of the manufacturers and the units, not the people who quietly, in offices and hangars on both sides of the Atlantic, made them what they were. To remember those people by name where the records remember them, and by simple acknowledgement where the records do not, is the only kind of preservation we can still offer. Subscribe if you want the next installment. There are more of these stories. There always are. The history of the air war is full of moments like Harker's, where one person, in one room, on one ordinary afternoon, made a decision that everyone afterward had to live with. Most of them are not famous. Most of them died as quietly as they had lived. They flew, they wrote, they argued, they pushed an idea through, and then they went home and made a cup of tea and read the paper and never once told the story afterward as though they had been important. They were important. We just have to do the work of remembering it for them.